Okay. Um, Hello, everyone. This is a presentation about narrative-driven game design. Um, I'll try to be brief and entertaining, but I think it's a mid-level presentation, and I think it will be packed with information. I have a Discord channel opened on my phone, so if you have any questions or something doesn't work, please let me know. It's Bartholomew A. Text channel. So let's start. This is a presentation about narrative-driven game design, and we'll be trying to answer the question how we can use stories to make better games. And we'll be first. I will introduce myself. Then we'll talk a moment about how stories work. It will be a slightly theoretical part. Then we'll compare stories as they happen in non-interactive media with gameplay, and we'll try to spot some similarities. Then I'll take a quick storyteller's look on games and some part of game mechanisms, and try to see how what we talked about before, how it works in the real world. And let's hope we'll finish with some ideas on narrative-driven game design. And first, let me introduce myself. My name is Artur Ganszyniec, and I'm a story and game designer. Right now, I'm a part of Different Tales. This is an indie storytelling game studio based in Poland. But before that, I worked for 11-Bit Studios. It's a Polish studio specializing in meaningful games like This War of Mine or Frostpunk. I worked on some mobile free-to-plays, and I worked on the first two games from the Witcher franchise when I was responsible for the story. And apart from that, I also teach game design and Łódź University of Technology. But this presentation will be mostly from game designers look, not from an academic point of view. And I would like to thank John York for his book Into the Woods: How Stories Work and Why We Tell Them. This is a great book, mainly about television, but it has some ideas that inspired me to think about how stories work in games, and some ideas from this book are used in this presentation. So if you can, and if you're interested in stories in general, go and read Into the Woods by John York. This is great, a great book. So I work mainly as story designer, and for many years I had different approaches to how stories and games interact. At the beginning of my career, I was just interested in the basics. How should we tell stories in games? How can I tell stories in games? Then I had this period of doubts when I was wondering if games can be used to tell good stories, or how good are games for telling stories. Then I had this fascination with mechanisms and environmental storytelling and using gameplay to tell stories. And finally, I started to think about how to design stories in games to make the best of the medium. But I think that after this, I don't know, 15 years in the business, the question that's most important for me is how can we use our knowledge of stories in general to make better games, because I think that this is possible, and this is something that we probably should strive to, because other media are great in telling stories, and they are telling stories that are relevant and moving and can change lives. And I think games are also a medium that can tell great stories, but in its own way. And we'll be thinking or talking a bit about it. So, how do stories work in general? This will be a brief, quest for a meaning. So, Most of the stories start like this or go like this. Once upon a time, there was someone living a normal life until it became clear that the person is lacking something vital. So they went out for a journey to find what was missing, and to get the treasure, they had to face a grave danger, a deadly danger. The odds seemed impossible, but they overcame all opposition, all challenges, and returned home with a prize that restored the balance. And the journey we are talking about can be a physical journey, can be a journey into ourselves, like introspection. The treasure can be a literal treasure, or a feeling, or some understanding about ourselves, or the life, or a person we love. The story can be comic or tragic or dramatic or boring, but most of the stories can be fit into this form. I think of it as the basic shape of a story, and of course there are a million of stories, and or even more, and every story is different. And there are clear examples when this pattern is broken, but still I think this is a relevant tool of thinking about how stories work. So in a way, every story has the same shape. It has beginning, middle, and end. And before the beginning, nothing interesting is happening concerning the story. And after the end, nothing interesting is happening, or interesting things concerning the story happened. The middle is all that leads from the beginning to the end in a logical sequence. And usually there's something unexpected happening between the beginning and middle and end. And this is also a great oversimplification, but at the same time, I find it a very useful tool of thinking about stories and story design. Um, and when we look at the tension in the story, we can see that at the beginning it's low. We are called to action. We have some initial successes. Then there's the midpoint, uh, when the tension is the highest. I don't mean the action, but the known versus unknown, uh, our emotional investment in the character. Then something important happened in the middle of the story, and usually things go wrong, and then depending on what kind of story it is, it ends in victory or defeat. So this is a basic dramatic arc of most of the stories ever told. So we can say it's the basic 5-act structure, and I don't mean the literal acts in the text as written, because they depend on many things. In the 90s, in the television, the acts were dictated by how often the broadcaster could or would broadcast the advertisement block. In the opera, the length of each act is more connected to how long a candle burns down and stuff like this. But from a technical side of view, I think most of the stories can be divided into five acts. The first act is the exposition, when we meet the people involved and we see the seed of the conflict planted. Then there are complications, intrigues, interests clash, and then there's climax. The protagonist is at the crossroads, and they make a decision that's important or learn something important. Then there's falling action. So we live through or see the consequences of the climax of the midpoint. We observe false hopes and fears, and then there's resolution. So catastrophe and downfall for tragedies, or victory and transfiguration for stories with happy ending. And this is also these points can be found in most of the stories, in most of the media. And when we think of a story as a series of changes, or a story as a story of change, we can see that there are two factors that change. And we'll talk now briefly about what can change within a story. I think the most moving change that happens is that the protagonist has a mask, a facade, and that's hiding a flaw or the true self of this person. And at the beginning of the story, the mask is dominant. Usually, in the middle, in the midpoint, we begin to glimpse or we see what's behind the mask, what is the true nature of the protagonist, and then the true nature wins and reveals itself. Also, it is what the protagonists think they need, what they desire versus what they really need. I can think that I need money, but in fact I long for love. And in the middle of the story, I make this decision to sacrifice my wealth to help someone whom I love, and then love wins. So my real need for human connection wins with my desire for money. In more action-oriented stories and in many games, this is opposition versus hero. So at the beginning of the story, the forces of opposition are overwhelming. Somewhere in the middle, we have the first significant victory, and then we consume that victory and vanquish the opposition. Or in the tragedies, the hero starts with the upper hand, but at the end of the story, well, Macbeth is dead and his opposition won. In games, it's also difficulty or perceived difficulty versus skill. So the longer I play, the longer I participate in the story, the better skills I have, the more skill I have, and the difficulty seems lower and lower. And in many murder mysteries, detective stories, this is ignorance versus knowledge. I have, or in puzzle games, at the beginning of the story, I know nothing. I have only suspicions. Then there's the breakthrough in the middle of the story, and in the end, I know how things work and know who done it and stuff like this. So knowledge wins. And as we can see, this is somehow or can be somehow compared to the famous hero's journey. This is a model of a story based on folk tales and some slightly outdated anthropological theories. It was compiled by Joseph Campbell and brought to Hollywood by Vogel. And this is the structure that was used to bring us Star Wars or Lion King. But when we take a step back, we can see that Hero's Journey in its many versions is just one of the instances of the five act structure. And so when we look at the journey the hero of a story makes, at the beginning we start with no knowledge, and we learn something that forces us to awaken. Then we have doubts whether venturing out there in the world or inside into my own feelings, whether it was a good idea. There's a reluctance the hero has to overcome, and they accept their calling. And they start experimenting with the world or with the knowledge, and in the middle of Act 3, there's usually this great breakthrough. We learn something important, gain the keen knowledge for the story, and start experimenting, having that knowledge, which also leads to doubt, growing reluctance, and regression. But finally, in the fifth act, the hero reawakens, accepts what they are, and regain total mastery. And I think that there is a very important reason why stories can be boiled down to such a shape or such a journey, because this is how our brains processes new information. This is the same shape of our human learning process. We start with a thesis, so a problem we have to solve. Then there's the antithesis, so our reaction to the problem, and that leads to synthesis, that is finding the solution. So stories are our brain's attempt to make sense of a chaotic universe. And there's this idea, neurological idea, that stories, that we as a species, as humans, evolved stories to survive. Like, stories are something that's rooted deeply in our brain, and that we used stories. We have used stories for thousands of years to survive as a species, and to learn about the world, and to make sense about the world. So stories are important, and probably are inevitable when you're a human. When I'm a human, I have to think in stories, because this is how my brain works. This is how I evolved. So we think in stories, and this is a very interesting experiment by a Russian movie director from 1905, who was called Kuznetsov, um, who presented the audience with three short movies, and each part of the audience saw another movie. And the first movie was about a man looking at a dead girl. The second movie was about a man looking at a bowl of soup, and the third was about a man looking at a beautiful woman. And the director asked the audience what they think, and they said that this actor is great, and that in the first movie, it they felt his sadness, that they see how sad he was while looking at probably his dead daughter. And in the second movie, the audience said that they felt the hunger in the eyes. They saw the hunger in the eyes of the actor when he was longingly looking at the bowl of soup. And in the third movie, the audience said that they admire how the actor played the desire he felt for the beautiful woman. But as we can probably suspect, uh, the actor had no idea what he was looking at. He was just asked or directed to look intensely at the camera, and then the movie um, was stitched together with some other footage of the girl, of the soup, and of the woman. So the actor could not play sadness, could not play hunger or desire, because he had no idea what he was looking at. But this is called Kuleshov effect, from the name of the director, and this is a phenomenon that happens in our brain, that we treat sequences of data, and when we see a sequence of data, of images, of words, we instinctively make stories out of them. We put them together, and we attribute motivations and emotions. So we see things that are not there, only because we need to see stories. So if we see a man, and then we see a dead girl, we automatically assume that the man is looking at the girl, and we assume that he is sad, and we are convinced, our brain is convinced, that this is what we saw. And this is a very important, I think it's an important thing to know, because it's a tool that can be used while making interactive stories, and we'll come back to this later. Apart from that, this is quite fascinating for me. So now let's look at stories and gameplay, and talk about the fractal nature of the universe. So when we play a game, there's usually this core gameplay loop in every game. And when we look at the shape of a gameplay loop, it seems a bit familiar, because there's usually an objective. There's a challenge preventing us from reaching the objective, but if we reach the objective, there's a reward. So it's a problem to solve. We react to the problem to find a solution. So this is also the shape of our learning process, which makes sense, because to master a game, when we play a game, we enter a new universe, and to master this new world, unknown world, we have to learn it. And how do we learn about stuff? Well, by telling stories. So the basic gameplay loop is also sort of a basic story because this is what our brain expects. So how do we put stories into gameplay? Well, I think the stories are already there. So when we play, our brain creates narratives, looks for motivations, attributes emotions, and does all this hard work without us even present that it's happening. So can we prevent from stories being told by gameplay? Well, Kuleshov says that not really. We can do this. Every systematic gameplay creates its own stories. Uh, and this is, I think, quite interesting. So when we look at stories, at any story in any media, the great story is usually a story about a complete change. It starts with exposition, some complications. There's a crisis and midpoint in the middle of the story, and then we see the consequences playing out, leading to a resolution. And usually, every story is divided into acts, and every act is about a major change within this big story. And usually every act starts with some setup. There's an element of journey or exploration leading to a climax and resolution, leading to the next act. And acts are usually divided into scenes, and every scene is a story about a minor change. So every scene is usually a conflict that ends in a turning point or a cliffhanger, opening another conflict in the next scene. And every scene can be divided into beats, and every bit is the simplest exchange, like action and reaction, like two lines of a dialogue in a movie. Or if we are watching some action movie, blows exchange between the protagonist and the villain. And when we look at games, every game starts with some exposition, maybe tutorial and complications. Then there are growing difficulty and growing stakes. And every game leads to this plateau of mastery, of end game, and we as a player or as a character have to grow to reach this plateau, and like and the game ends. And games are usually divided into quests or missions or levels, and every such portion of a game starts with an objective. Then there's some exploration or struggle on the way to reaching the objective, and it usually ends in some final challenge, leading to a resolution and probably to the next level quest or mission. And every level quest can be divided into encounters, and by encounter I mean a singular challenge that has a win or fail state that then leads to the next challenge. And then there's second to second gameplay, which is action and reaction. So I don't know, when I'm playing Mario, second to second gameplay is deciding when to jump, when to press the jump button, for example. And in fighting games, action reaction is exchanging blows with the with the enemy. So when we compare this fractal nature of stories and games, we can see that every game that game is also a story about a change, that we start knowing not much and knowing a lot, or our character changes from having no skills to being very skilled. And every level of a game has the same function as acts in a story in other media, and scenes are more or less the same what encounters are in games. And second to second gameplay has the same action reaction dynamic as beats in movies or in books. Uh, so so games, even analyzed just from the gameplay perspective, have the same characteristics and the same parts as stories in other media. And at every level of this fractal, the hero or heroine faces a problem and reacts to find a solution. So that means that every small part of a game or a story, whether small or big, is about a problem that we have to overcome and about finding or deciding how to face the problem and about living with the consequences of that choice. And yeah, so before we proceed, let's stop for a moment and think what makes a protagonist, what makes a hero, because I use this word many times in this presentation, the hero, the protagonist, but what does it actually mean? So let's think about, let's imagine some situations. There's a bar, and in a bar a woman walks up to a man who is drinking alone and says, and let's stop at the moment. Or a boy is bullied at school and the boy finds a magic lamp and asks the djinn for, and stop here. Or a man loses his family in an accident and one day he wakes up and decides. Or a huntress stands at an entrance to a cave, she sniffs the air and, yeah, and what do we think about those characters? I think we have no idea whether they are heroes or villains, or we have no emotional connections to them because they haven't acted yet. Because what makes a hero unique is the decision made in a moment of crisis. The huntress would be one type of a hero if she enters the cave, would be another type of a hero if she flees away, and would be yet another type of a hero if she prepares and then enters. So what makes a hero unique is the decision made in a moment of crisis. That's why the first moment when we can empathize and understand a hero is when they act. And why am I stressing this so much? Why do I find this so important? Because in game, that crucial decision that shapes the protagonist is usually made by the player. And this makes all the difference. This is what I think makes game unique as compared to other storytelling media. So let's take a storyteller's take on games. Like take a look at some certain gameplay mechanisms from a storyteller's perspective and see how they fit together. So we'll be looking at points that are connected to this player's agency I was talking about, to this phenomenon that the player is probably the one shaping the crucial decisions in the story. So we'll take a look at motivations and empathy and subverting expectations. We'll talk a bit about dialogues and exposition, and we'll brush the huge topic that are emergent narratives. So let's start with motivation and empathy. Why is it important? Because if we know that the crucial decision about the protagonist, about the story, is made by the player has to make this decision knowing what's happening. So players need empathetic characters to make informed decisions. And what I mean by empathetic characters, as a player, I have to believe in my character's motivation. I have to understand what the antagonist wants and why. And ideally, I can tell how my opponents feel, what their emotions are. So switching the table, when designing a story, this is what I as a designer or writer have to focus about on making the characters believable and their motivations understandable, not only to the protagonist, but also to the player. So yeah, and there are some red flags that should make us, that can make us aware that something's not working, not exactly working. The first is that if characters in cutscenes are different than in gameplay. It is hard to avoid. It happens in many games, but I think this is a part when we can lose the player or the player's emotional investment in the story, because the part that's important to the player is the gameplay, is what happens during the play, and if we oppose that or present the character, the protagonist, in a different way during cutscenes, when the player has no control, we can lose players' interest or even lose their trust in us as storytellers. And that means that the more decisions are made by the player, the more emotionally engaging the story is, and I think the better it will resonate. It has potential to better resonate with players, and by opposition, if we make decisions for the player, we are taking emotions out of the story. And another red flag is if a motivation in a scene comes only from gameplay. If I'm doing something against the protagonist, against the story, the logic of the story, but I'm doing this because it's an optimal path of playing. So if gameplay goals are not aligned with story goals, this is a moment that needs correction, I think. And now a few words about subverting expectations, because as you probably thought during this presentation, this neat 5-act structure, well, it can be found in many stories, but there are definitely stories that have a structure that is slightly different. And this is done for a reason, because sometimes to create something original or just to break the boredom, non-interactive media are using so-called dark inversions. So, for example, hero's flaw is his virtue. This happened in the Godfather movies, when the flaw that the main character had to fight was that he was a good man at the beginning of the story, and at the end of the story he was a villain, and he had to make this decision to become a bad man. So he was fighting with his good side, which is something totally different to how stories usually work. So this is a moment when hero's true self is evil, or when a story ends in a catastrophe, like in many Shakespeare's dramas. Everyone is dead at the end, and those are really riveting stories to watch, to read. But how do I feel about it when I do not watch the hero, but if I am the hero? This is a very delicate moment or process from designer's point of view, because not all players want to be evil. Not all players want their story to end in catastrophe. And this can be done. And if it's done, those games are really striking, brilliant. But there are many games out there in the market that try to subvert the structure using those dark inversions and fail emotionally. I just lose interest in the character, and when I feel forced to do something that I do not choose to do, I'm like, oh, okay, it's just a game, and so let's ignore the story and just focus on shooting bad guys or stuff like this. And but there's also another way of making stories interesting, and this is disturbing the structure, like when parts of the character arcs are missing or misplaced. And if you've seen the movie No Country for Old Men, spoiler alert, the main character is killed off screen, and we do not see the final fight, we just see the aftermath of the fight. And this is a very powerful breaking of the structure. And This happens in games a lot because difficulty curve and fail reload system is used. I- I- this is something what games use to tell about the character arc and to tell the stories about failures. So when my character dies in a game and when I reload from a checkpoint, this is an equivalent of disturbing the 5-act structure. But this is also game's way of telling a story about trial and error and about learning and about failure. And this is a way of telling the story unique to games because there are usually no, fail reload systems in books. And this kind of disturbance of the structure creates surprise and dissonance and very strong emotional response. So when it's used properly and with tact, it can make great memories for the player. It can create great memories for the player. And at the same time, overuse or mishandled, it causes frustration. So this is just food for thought. Will not be dwelling on that more. And now a few words about dialogues and exposition. I think I like thinking of conversation as action scenes. So using the same the same story shape or the same um, schema about conflict to write good dialogues. So we can use opposition to present a dilemma and then use the dilemma to characterize the protagonist. So um, so every dialogue is a dilemma to be solved, a decision to be made, an opposition to be overcome. So it's an action scene, and usually the words show the facade that the player and the protagonist wants to maintain, the mask that they wear, but the range of choices in a dialogue, in an interactive dialogue, reveal the true nature of the character. Because if let's say that that someone asks us for help, and among the options we can choose, there is the option that says, no, I don't want to help you. And even if we choose that we want to help the character, we know that this protagonist is a person that at least thinks about not helping people. So choices in interactive dialogues are a way of showing the whole spectrum of the protagonist's thoughts or the all possible choices uh, they can make. So this is a way of presenting the player the true nature of the character and then allowing the player to explore the true nature or to maintain the mask, the facade. And every dialogue should prepare the scene for a change or revelation. So as in books or as in movies, every dialogue, every scene should push the story forward and prepare for some change or some new information. And there is one thing or another set of tools that we can make to make dialogues interesting. And the first of it is that people like to work for the entertainment. So we can, instead of making clear exposition and writing dialogues, presenting facts, we can write dialogues asking very easy questions. Because if I write how much is 2 plus 2, everyone will know it's 4, but still it's sort of a better dialogue than if I wrote just 4, because I as a player, I like to feel clever. I like to feel that I understand things and that I can think and reason and make connections. And if we write as writers, if we write dialogues in such a way that there are questions that are quite easy to answer, the dialogues are instantly more interesting. And for a long time, as a writer, I had those fear that when I'm writing an interactive dialogue that is very branched and I have no real control about how player explores the branches, and uh, I have really not much control about um, the sequence in which players will receive some parts of the information. I was very frustrated and a bit, afraid that the story may stop making sense. But there's Kuleshov effect. So uh, it's almost a given that players will create their own sense and they will subconsciously uh, um, bridge the gaps and straighten the edges and make this a consistent story within their heads, because that's what we do as humans. And as a writer, I also like skipping dialogues altogether, because there are moments in games when something can be told by a system in a much more interesting way than by a dialogue. And let me use an example from the games I was in contact with. First, in the Witcher game, every time you meet um, a seller or a merchant, there's this short dialogue like, hello, what are you selling? Well, I'm selling armor, yada yada, small talk. And uh, almost all players just skip it because they know that they talk to a merchant and they just want to buy and sell things. And in this War of Mine, this is a game that's a simulator of a civilian during a war. When a merchant comes or someone who wants to trade goods, there's no dialogue, just a window open, and you can um, trade goods, and the interface tells you if the seller is okay with such exchange, or if they want more or less, and stuff like this. So we still have a story about buying and selling stuff, but if we have a system that tells it, we probably don't need any dialogue to tell the same story. And dialogues require some investment from the player, especially in games. Reading and or listening to dialogues and not skipping them. It is a work to be done, and no, not all players are fans of dialogues. So we can use surprises, unexpected emotions, or new knowledge to make dialogues more interesting, or to reward and motivate players. And when we talk about games with our friends, we usually talk about our personal narratives. So we talk about things that happened in games, but some of the stories were not written by anyone, especially in open world games. They are just event sequences that we interpret as stories. And the way they combine the random events combined perceives our emotions and motivations, and we make stories that aren't really there, but the stories are real for us. So emergent stories are important because if your game generates emergent stories, people will probably talk about your game. But those stories are almost impossible to track, because I don't know what series of random events, uh, which series of random events are important to this player, and which are important to that player, because that stems from the player's personal experiences. But we may enhance the stories by giving feedback to player choices and states. So if let's say I have an open world game about stealing cars, and if people on the side will go like, oh, nice car, when I have a nice car, there's a possibility that it will trigger my personal story about, for example, I don't know, finding and stealing a really nice car, and people seeing and commenting it, and uh, I will feel fine with it and will talk to my friends about it. And the designers would probably won't be aware about my experiences and my emotions, but the game will comment on what I've done, and it will create a personal story for me. So let's wrap it up. So how to make sure that my game is a good story, or what could be a narrative driven game design? So let's say that it is safe to say that most players need a coherent story. So every story probably needs a theme, and a theme usually starts with a question. That's important. So the game asks a question, and as a player, have some assumptions about what the answer to this question is. And this question is, for example, I don't know, how much can I sacrifice to take revenge? Or can I be the best detective ever? Or can I don't know, kill all those creepy aliens or survive zombie apocalypse? Then most of the game is exploration of those theme of this question. So I have some assumptions, and I face challenges, and I try to find my own personal answer to the first question. And usually the game ends with a conclusion, so with the answer to the question. And so that's so the basic. To make a story in a game important, we just have to make it a learning experience. But the last slides ended with a conclusion or an answer. But whose answer? In games, the answer is not universal. It always has an author, but the authors can be either the designer. I make a game that has only one ending, and the answer to the first question is the answer that I wrote as the designer. Or if the game is more branched or has a branch story, I can present a range of choices to the player, and players choose their own answer. Or if this is open or systematic game, highly replayable, probably players find their own answers all the time. Their answers are internal and emergent, and I, as designer, had no idea what those answers were unless the players will tell me on the internet or by mail. So basic story and gameplay building block is this that elements that make a particular gameplay mechanism a good story is when it mirrors learning experience, human learning experience. So a basic gameplay building block usually starts with a discovery. Then there's the truth. Actually, that we learn the true nature of the opposition, or hero flows reveals itself, and then we assimilate the knowledge to success or fail. And I have this checklist that tells me if my game is a good story. So I ask what the protagonist wants, what the opposition wants. I check if the player wants the same thing as the protagonist. I pinpoint the moment of choice. I write down what's at stake. And I know I'm aware what the protagonists learn and what the players learn. And I check if the protagonists change or reveal some inner truth in such way. And on a scene basis, it's that I make sure that I know what player expects from entering the scene, what player learns when interacting with the scene, and I make sure that player can use the knowledge to finish the game to win the scene and the next scene. So when we look at stories in games, the universal quest goes like this. Every story is about a journey, and I will be wrapping the stream in a minute. So every story is about a journey. Finding the missing part is retrieval and the making of something whole. And the universal part of a gameplay is that every game is a conflict. Two oppositions clash and are assimilated. And this is this reflects the learning process. So asking a question, testing it against the world, and assimilating what we've learned. And so to make a story that's a good game, we have to ask a questions, let the players learn, and assimilate the answer. And that's our toolbox. But to make a good story, we also just have, something interesting to say. So let's wrap it up, and thank you very much.